It was just over a year ago that Simpson, a 26-year-old man, lost his wife, Sophie. Their two young children, only 18 months and 4 years old, were suddenly without their mother. The raw pain of Sophie's absence was a constant companion, a stark reminder of a parallel in Simpson's own life. He was just 5 years old when his mother passed away. The echoes of his childhood loss were chilling, forcing him to confront the full circle his life had unexpectedly taken. Simpson's mother's death wasn't a single memory, it was a pervasive shadow that stretched long over his childhood. Everything seemed a bit grayer, more muted without her presence. The house was quieter, and his father, overwhelmed by his own grief, tried to fill the void. He worked long hours and offered forced smiles, but the sadness was always there. Simpson remembered feeling perpetually confused, wondering why his mother was gone. Friends would talk about their mothers, their plans for Mother's Day, and it felt like living in a world where everyone else had something precious that he had lost. Birthdays and holidays were particularly difficult, marked by a unique emptiness that came from missing the person who was supposed to be there. As Simpson grew older, that confusion transformed into a deep-seated fear of loss. He found himself either clinging too tightly to relationships or shying away from them entirely to avoid potential heartbreak. It wasn't until his own adult relationships that he began to truly understand the depth of his fear. Therapy eventually helped him to talk about his mother, the memories, and the pain, making it more bearable. Losing his mother so young fundamentally shaped who he was, making him more empathetic towards others' pain and more aware of life's fragility. The world had suddenly seemed bigger and more intimidating without his mother, even though he was too young to fully grasp the impact of her passing. There was an undeniable emptiness at home, a silence that wasn't just about the absence of her voice, but about the missing layer of love and security she had represented. Sophie, too, had experienced profound loss early in her life. She often spoke of her father, recalling a vivid memory of him lifting her high above his head, making her feel like she could touch the clouds. She was just 6 when he was taken from her by a sudden illness. That loss carved a deep, aching void in her life, shaping her in ways she sometimes discussed. She grew up determined to be the pillar her dad couldn't be for her, to build a fortress of love for their children that nothing, not even death, could penetrate. But life, as it often does, had other plans. It was a crisp fall morning, much like any other, except Sophie wasn't feeling well. At first, they thought little of it, hoping it was just a passing bug. But it proved to be far more serious. Within months, they were grappling with a reality that mirrored her deepest fears. Sophie was diagnosed with a terminal illness, one that crept up silently but quickly overwhelmed. In those final months, Sophie's resolve to create lasting memories with their children became everything. Every day, despite her waning strength, she spent time with them, reading stories, playing games, or simply holding them close, embedding her presence in their lives in ways she hoped would be indelible. She often spoke to Simpson late at night, her voice a mixture of determination and despair, about her urgent need to leave a legacy of love for them, to be there in their hearts and minds even when she could no longer be there in person. She desperately wanted to break the cycle of loss that had shadowed her own childhood, to give their children the stable, loving foundation she had lost so early on. Her biggest fear was repeating history, leaving their children with the same hollow memories and unanswerable questions she had struggled with. Watching Sophie with their children, Simpson witnessed the lengths she went to imprint her love on their young lives. She recorded videos for them, left little notes in unexpected places, and created traditions that could carry on in her absence. Her creativity in weaving these threads of connection was both inspiring and heartbreaking. When she passed, the loss was monumental, echoing the emptiness of her own childhood, but also filled with the richness of the love she had poured into every moment with them. Sophie had always had a clear vision for her own funeral, as unusual as that might sound. It was something they had talked about occasionally, those strange, somber discussions that unexpectedly pop up and linger between a couple. She wanted it to be more a celebration of her life than a mourning of her death. "Don't make it all doom and gloom," she'd say, half joking but serious about the essence of her wishes. "Make it a day where everyone can remember the happy times, with lots of flowers and maybe even some fireworks." When it happened, Simpson was plunged into a deep grief that was hard to navigate, filled with the pain of loss, but also the duty to honor her final wishes. The day of her funeral arrived on a bright and clear morning, which felt almost offensive in the context of their loss, yet fitting for the type of farewell she had envisioned. The service was held at their local church, a place she had chosen not just for its spiritual significance, but also for its beautiful stained glass windows and the way the sunlight danced through them in the mornings. It was here, under the vivid colors cast by the morning light, that friends and family gathered, not in black, but in bright colors, as she had requested. Flowers adorned every surface, wildflowers, her favorite, in vibrant hues of blues, yellows, and reds, creating a tapestry of color that transformed the usually somber space into one that was alive with remembrance and love. The air was filled with her favorite music, a mix of classic rock and folk tunes, songs that had soundtracked their life together. Each melody stirred memories, bringing smiles even through the tears. After the service, they moved to a nearby park, another place Sophie loved. It was here that the atmosphere lightened as people shared their stories about Sophie, her quirks, her laugh, her boundless energy. It felt like she was there with them, in the laughter and the shared memories. As the sun began to set, they prepared for the final act of the day, the fireworks. It was an unconventional choice, but it was exactly what she had wanted. As the first rocket shot into the sky, bursting into a cascade of color, it felt like a release, a letting go of some of the sorrow and a celebration of a spirit too vibrant to ever be really gone. Each explosion of light was a reminder of her vibrant life, a punctuating finale that she would have loved. Now, as Simpson watched their children grow, he saw Sophie's influence in their resilience, their laughter, and even in their tears. They talked about her often, recalling moments he didn't even realize they remembered. It was clear that while death took Sophie away too soon, her efforts to be a present, loving force in their lives didn't go in vain. She lived on through them, through the stories they shared and the love they kept alive. As their father, Simpson's role had evolved to not just nurturing them, but also preserving the essence of what Sophie wanted for them, a sense of security, love, and the knowledge that they were and always would be cherished, no matter what life threw their way. Now, as he watched his own children, Simpson saw that same confusion and loss reflected in their eyes. They looked for Sophie in simple moments, when they accomplished something small like tying their shoelaces, or when they needed comfort after a bad dream. He knew those feelings, he lived them. It was a reminder of how deeply a child feels the absence of a parent, often in ways they couldn't fully express. This shared experience had deepened his empathy and understanding of his children's emotions. He often found himself navigating their grief while managing his own, trying to be the rock that they could lean on. It wasn't just about providing for them materially, but ensuring they felt safe and loved, that they had space to miss their mom without feeling like they needed to hide their grief. Their journey through loss had also reshaped Simpson's approach to parenting. He was more patient, more attuned to the unspoken parts of their sadness, and more proactive in addressing their emotional health as a family. They talked about Sophie often, keeping her memory alive not as a shadow that hung over them, but as a light that continued to guide them. He strove to be present in a way he felt his own father struggled to be after his mother died. Seeing his children cope with their loss, he understood the long road ahead of them. He knew the challenges they'd face as they grew up without their mom, but he also saw their resilience, and it gave him hope. It reminded him that while the pain of loss never fully disappeared, it could be woven into the fabric of their lives, making them stronger and more connected to each other. He promised himself to be there for them, to help them navigate this journey, and to ensure they never doubted they were loved, both by their mom, whose love continued beyond her absence, and by him, who stood with them every step of the way. After his own mother passed away, the house had felt suspended in time, with remnants of her life tucked into every corner. Her clothes still hung in the closet, Her books remained on the shelves, and the air carried the gentle hint of her perfume. This stillness, this preserved world of hers, was abruptly disrupted when his father announced he was remarrying. It was barely a year since they'd lost her, and the news fell on him like a cold wave. Ellen moved in shortly after their wedding. She brought with her boxes filled with new items, new routines, and a new presence that seemed to flood the spaces his mother had once inhabited. Her attempts at reorganizing the house, from rearranging the living room to replacing the curtains his mother had chosen, felt less like mere changes and more like erasures of the life they had lived. Ellen was kind, or at least she tried to be. She would cook meals she thought Simpson would enjoy and make small talk, attempting to bridge the gap between them. However, her efforts felt forced. Each kind gesture, no matter how well-intended, felt like an intrusion, as if she was trying to stitch herself into the fabric of a family portrait where she didn't quite belong. Simpson resisted, not out of spite for her as a person, but out of a deep-seated loyalty to his mother's memory and a child's grief that clung stubbornly to the past. The situation at home grew tense. Simpson's reactions to Ellen's changes ranged from silent withdrawal to outright defiance. He would put things back where his mother had left them, insist on using the same old dishes instead of the new ones Ellen brought, and avoid spending time in the newly redecorated spaces. He missed the familiarity of his old life, the comfort of knowing every corner held a piece of his mom. His dad, caught between his attempt to move forward and his child's resistance, often became frustrated. Arguments became more frequent. He would accuse Simpson of being unreasonable, of not giving Ellen a fair chance. Simpson saw it differently. He felt his father was erasing his mother's legacy, pushing him to forget rather than remember. One particularly heated evening, his dad snapped after finding him rearranging the living room to its original state. "We can't live in a museum," he yelled. "We have to move on, you have to move on." But how could he move on? His mother's shadow was in every laughter that had echoed through those rooms, in every step he took around the furniture she had carefully chosen, in every scent that lingered. The house felt increasingly like a battleground, where every alteration to its old state felt like a loss, a reminder of how swiftly and ruthlessly life could change. Ellen, caught in the middle, gradually stopped trying so hard to win him over, retreating instead into whatever peace she could find with his dad. During those initial months after Ellen moved in, the atmosphere in their home became increasingly strained. Simpson was still grappling with the loss of his mother, often finding solace in old photos and mementos that kept her memory alive. His vulnerability and frequent bouts of tears were a stark reminder of the raw pain that lingered in their home. It was during this time that his dad's demeanor towards him shifted drastically. The few times Simpson showed vulnerability or cried for his mother, his father reacted not with comfort, but with frustration. He would yell, telling him to grow up and stop crying. It was clear he was grappling with his own pain, but his approach left Simpson feeling abandoned in his grief. One night, after finding him crying in his room with a picture of his mother, his dad barked enough. "You need to grow up and stop crying all the time. Life has to move on." His words, meant to push him towards resilience, felt more like a dismissal of his grief. Simpson looked up at him, his heart sinking. "I miss her, Dad," he managed to choke out, the words barely a whisper. "Why can't you just let me miss her?" His next words were like a cold slap. "I'm happier now, and you should be too. I love Ellen more than I ever loved your mom," he declared with a harsh certainty that seemed to seal the growing gap between them. The room fell silent, save for the quiet sobs that Simpson couldn't hold back. Those words, harsh and raw, sliced through the fragile thread of understanding that had tethered them. He felt not just the loss of his mother, but also the creeping loss of his dad, who was now a stranger, driven by his own grief and newfound happiness. As the years passed, the emotional distance grew. His dad was increasingly absent, not just physically but emotionally. Simpson's cries for attention, for the affection he missed so desperately, went unanswered. His father's priorities had shifted, and Simpson felt sidelined, an unwelcome reminder of a past his father wanted to forget. Ellen, for all her efforts, could never bridge the gap between his dad and him. It felt like a betrayal, not just of his mother's memory but of the father-son bond they should have had. Feeling abandoned and misunderstood, Simpson withdrew into himself. The isolation at home led him to seek solace elsewhere, in books, in school activities, anywhere he could find a semblance of the care and attention he lacked at home. But the impact of those formative years lingered. He harbored a deep-seated mistrust for relationships, fearful of being left behind again, of loving someone who might one day decide he wasn't worth sticking around for. As an adult, looking back, he could see that his dad was dealing with his grief in his own flawed way, but the understanding of his father's pain did little to soothe the resentment and hurt of a child who felt left behind. Now, facing his own challenges as a widower, Simpson was determined to be the father to his children that he needed when he was their age, one who was present, supportive, and unconditionally loving, no matter what life threw their way. After Sophie died, his father reached out, telling him he hoped Simpson understood him better and would cut him some slack for everything. Simpson didn't respond at the time, still in the most immediate sense of grief. Even today, the pain was still raw, but he was in therapy, trying to find peace in his life. His father reached out a few more times, apologizing for his initial message. They met up a few days ago, per his request, at a quiet cafe, a neutral place that seemed suitable for what was already a tense discussion waiting to unfold. As Simpson sat across from his father, still wearing his wedding ring, a stark symbol of his ongoing grief, it didn't take long for the conversation to veer into uncomfortable territory. His father noticed the ring almost immediately and took it as a cue to voice his thoughts on moving forward. "You can't keep living in the past," he said. "It's time to think about your future. Maybe start meeting people again." Simpson clenched his jaw, feeling the old frustration simmer. He asked his father to drop the subject, but he pressed on, perhaps thinking that pushing him was for his own good. That's when he brought up his own past, his quick remarriage after Simpson's mother's death. He explained, not for the first time but certainly in the most explicit way, how his new wife had brought him happiness, something he thought was impossible after his mother. "I needed that, and I think you do too," he said earnestly. "I thought you'd understand by now, especially with the kids needing a mother figure." His words stung sharply. It wasn't just the suggestion that he replace Sophie, but the implication that his grief was somehow a selfish indulgence, that he should move past it for the sake of the kids. His father went further, saying that he hoped Simpson would eventually see the benefit of his choices, that he would stop holding onto his resentment and realize that embracing someone new wasn't a betrayal of his late wife. Simpson told him firmly, "It doesn't work that way. Grieving isn't just something you turn off to make room for someone else, and it certainly doesn't work on a convenient timeline." He could see the frustration in his father's face, mirroring the anger in his own. "You think I hate you for being happy with her, but it's not about that. It's about how you handled everything when Mom died, how you pushed her memory out as if it was the only way to be happy again." His father was taken aback by Simpson's bluntness. Perhaps he hadn't realized how deeply his actions had hurt him, or maybe he had never considered that his path to happiness had left a trail of pain in its wake. Their conversation grew heated, voices raised enough that other patrons shot them wary glances. The air was tense as Simpson and his father reached a fragile point in their conversation. His father's earlier remarks about moving on and finding new love had pushed Simpson to a breaking point. Seeing the shock on his father's face when he challenged his views on grief and moving forward, he paused, looking genuinely bewildered. "How do you expect to find someone else to love you and the kids if you're still hung up on Sophie?" he asked, his voice tinged with concern but also a hint of frustration. It was a question that might have been genuine in his mind, but felt like an accusation to Simpson. "Sophie was the love of my life," Simpson replied, his voice firm, each word laden with unyielding truth. "And yes, I'm still hung up on her, because love doesn't just end when someone dies. You don't just replace someone like that." He could see his father trying to process his words, his eyes searching Simpson's for something, perhaps a sign of the son he once knew who hadn't been shattered by loss. Simpson continued, "My children, they are my heart, Dad. They're the other loves of my life. But it's different. They depend on me not just to love them, but to provide safety, security, and a sense of normalcy in a world that was turned upside down. The cafe noises faded into the background as he leaned in slightly, needing his father to really hear him. It's my job, my duty, to give them the best life I can. That doesn't mean rushing to fill a void with a new person. It means being there for them fully, without distractions or replacements for their mom. His father was stunned, perhaps by the intensity of Simpson's conviction or maybe by the realization that their views on handling grief and love were worlds apart. "But you need someone too," he finally muttered, almost to himself, a note of sadness creeping into his voice. "I needed my dad when I lost my mom," Simpson shot back, the words spilling out with a mix of pain and defiance. "But instead, I got a man who was too quick to move on, too quick to replace her. I won't do that to my kids. I won't let them feel as I did, secondary to someone else's happiness." They were at the end of their coffees, the dregs cold and bitter, much like the mood that had settled over their table. As his father eyed him, ready to offer another piece of his mind on how Simpson should live his life, Simpson cut him off. The frustration and hurt from years of bottled-up feelings were brimming over. "I need to make this clear," he began, his voice steady but filled with resolve. "I will never, ever tell my children to just get over their mom's death. I'm not going to sit them down and tell them their mom is dead and that they need to accept a new mother." The cafe, usually a backdrop of clinking cups and indistinct chatter, seemed to quieten around them. His dad watched him, his expression hardening as he prepared to defend his own actions again. But Simpson wasn't finished. "And another thing," he continued, "I'm not going to scold them for missing her, for crying out for her at night. It's normal. They're kids, and they lost their mother. How could I possibly take that grief and make it about someone else's discomfort? That's not what they need. They need a dad who understands their pain, not one who silences it." His dad shifted uncomfortably, his eyes briefly dropping to the table before meeting Simpson's again. "You think I don't know that?" he muttered, his voice a mix of defensiveness and weariness. "I think you forgot it when it mattered," Simpson shot back, unable to keep the edge out of his voice. "You remarried so quickly, and it felt like you were trying to erase Mom from our lives. You expected me to just accept it, to be okay with all the changes, because you were." Simpson leaned forward, making sure his point was clear. "I am not looking to find them a new mother. What I am striving to do is to be the best dad I can be, given the shitty hand we've been dealt. I want to give them stability, love, and understanding, not rush to fill a perceived gap with the first person who comes along." He paused, his heart pounding with the intensity of the confession. "And I will never, ever make them feel like they are second to anyone else in my life, the way you did with me. You made it clear you loved your new wife more, and I felt like I had lost you too, not just Mom." His father finally said something about regret, how he regretted that Simpson couldn't see his perspective, that maybe one day he'd understand. But as Simpson walked away from that cafe, he knew that understanding wasn't just about seeing his father's point of view. It was about recognizing the deep divides in how they process loss. He wasn't ready to forgive his father's past actions just because he had found happiness. His path was different, and he needed his father to respect that, without judgment or pressure. As he drove home, the weight of their fractured relationship heavier than ever, he realized that some gaps might be too wide to bridge, at least for now. The last time Simpson saw his dad at that cafe felt like a definitive line had been drawn. In the weeks that followed, his father tried to reach out a few times, texts, a couple of voicemails. His voice always held that familiar mix of concern and awkwardness, as if he wasn't quite sure what to say or how to say it without reigniting the flames of their last argument. Each attempt at bridging the gap seemed to remind Simpson of the wide chasm that had formed between them over the years. He wasn't ready to cross it yet, so he responded sparingly, his replies brief and non-committal, until eventually he stopped responding altogether. The silence that settled wasn't peaceful, but it was necessary. Life went on, as it does, filled with the daily routines and small crises of raising two children alone. Simpson threw himself into being a dad, the soccer games, school projects, bedtime stories. Every smile and tear from his children reminded him of his promise to be the steady presence they needed. He often thought about that conversation with his dad, turning over his words in his mind, questioning the harshness of his responses and the rigidness of his stance. Yet, every time he considered reaching out, he remembered the feeling of being a child who felt second best, and he'd retreat, convinced he needed more time. Months turned into a year. The seasons changed, and so did the children. They grew taller, their faces losing the last traces of toddlerhood. His dad's attempts to connect became a memory, almost as distant as the happier times before his mother's death. In the quiet moments late at night, when the house was still and his mind refused to rest, Simpson pondered the cost of his steadfastness. Was holding on to his hurt worth the growing silence between them? It was a chilly evening, the kind that hinted at the approach of winter, as Simpson climbed up to the attic to sort through some old boxes that had been gathering dust. The attic, with its musty smell and beams of moonlight sneaking through the small window, always felt like a capsule of the past, untouched and full of secrets waiting to be rediscovered. As he sifted through the boxes, his hands found an old photo album, its cover worn and slightly faded. Curiosity piqued, he sat down on an old creaky chair, the album resting heavily in his lap. Flipping it open, he was greeted by vibrant pictures of his mom and dad. They were younger then, full of life and laughter, captured in moments of sheer joy, picnics in the park, beach vacations, and quiet afternoons at home. Each photo was a portal to a time before grief had reshaped their lives, to a family that once was. His finger traced the outlines of those happier days, lingering on the images of his dad with his wide, carefree smile. It struck Simpson then how much he missed his father, not just the physical presence, but the essence of who he had been before tragedy had turned him into someone Simpson could barely recognize, let alone understand. Seeing him so happy and unburdened in these photos made the contrast with his later years even more poignant. A wave of nostalgia washed over him, softening the hard edges of the resentment he'd held onto for so long. It wasn't just his mother he missed, but his dad as he was back then. It dawned on him how much the sorrow had changed his father, how it had stolen that joyful person from the photographs and left someone else in his place, someone consumed by his own grief, making choices Simpson couldn't comprehend. Sitting there in the attic, surrounded by relics of his childhood, Simpson felt the weight of years of misunderstanding and misconnections heavy on his chest. The memories of laughter and love, so vivid in those photographs, seemed at odds with the strained, awkward encounters that had defined their recent years. The realization was a quiet but profound turning point. Maybe there was room for reconciliation, a chance to rediscover the man from those pictures, to understand the journey he had taken from there to here. Perhaps it was time to bridge the gap that grief had widened, to approach him not just as the man who had made decisions Simpson struggled to forgive, but as his dad, who had once been the entire world to a much younger version of him. Resolute, Simpson closed the album, a plan forming in his mind. He would reach out to him, try to initiate a conversation, not just about what went wrong, but about what had once been right. It felt like a daunting task, filled with potential for pain, but also for healing. As he descended from the attic, leaving the quiet sanctuary of the past behind, he was ready to face whatever came next, armed with newfound understanding and a hopeful heart. It made him think about how the children would remember these years. Would they see a dad who stood his ground or one who let old wounds dictate the future? The thought unsettled him enough to consider that perhaps it was time to try a different approach, not for his sake, but for the children, who deserved to know all facets of their family, even the complicated ones. The next morning, Simpson drafted a message to his dad, simple yet more open than anything he'd sent in a long time. "Let's talk," it read, "when you're ready." He wasn't sure where a conversation might lead them or whether it would heal any old hurts, but he knew it was a start, a small step toward understanding, or at least coexistence, in this new chapter of their lives. As he hit send, the silence he had grown accustomed to seemed a little less daunting, tinted with the possibility of something new.